Hello everyone, I want to talk about this video titled Why Japan's Internet is Weirdly Designed by the channel Answer in Progress. In this video, the presenter, Sabrina Cruz, claims that she's finally found the reason that convinced her why she thinks Japan's web design is weird. Now, Sabrina Cruz's background is in STEM, I think. I can't really tell. She seems to have experience with coding and AI, but this video is about web design, and not just any kind of web design, Japanese web design. Web design does involve some coding, but it's also primarily about, design, and coding is just one way to facilitate that. Design requires some knowledge on visual arts and an eye for visual appeal. Sabrina Cruz, as far as I can tell, is not a web designer, given the sponsor of this very video, and she doesn't claim to speak Japanese either. So we have a bit of a problem here. A non-Japanese speaking, non-web designer claiming she has cracked the code, so to speak, as to why Japanese web design is quote-unquote weird. As for me, while I'm a graphic designer, I'm not a Japanese web designer either. I have some familiarity with the Japanese web, but I wouldn't want to speak on it with authority. So take my word with a pinch of salt. Before we go further, here's something I want to make clear just so we are on the same page. There are two types of research, primary and secondary. Primary research, also known as original research, is conceived, designed, conducted, and interpreted by the researchers themselves. Secondary research is conducted by using other people's primary research, especially their data and their conclusions. Experts conduct both primary and secondary research. Non-experts, on the other hand, should only conduct secondary research because we lack the expertise necessary to even design and interpret our research in the first place. When your favorite edutainment YouTubers say they do research, what they often mean is they do secondary research. They read existing literature, like books, articles, and papers, and if they have even more journalistic integrity, they interview experts. Examples of YouTube channels which have done secondary research well are Tom Scott, Veritasium, Cleo Abram, Vox, etc. What if I, as a non-expert in Japanese web design, wanted to research why Japanese web design is quote-unquote weird? I'd never do primary research. I'd only do secondary research. I defer to experts, and for two reasons. One, I don't have the necessary knowledge to design and interpret my own research. And two, I might have historical and cultural blind spots that I'm not aware of. As far as I can tell, Sabrina Cruz is not an expert in Japanese and web design either. Before I break down this video, I'd like you to first check the companion article Sabrina Cruz wrote for this video, which is also a way to promote her sponsor. Both the video and this article were published in November 2022. This article includes some details cut out of the video, as well as inline citations and a list of links to her sources. Now, I find this list of sources rather troubling. It seems extremely skewed in favor of the narrative Sabrina Cruz had in mind. It doesn't give me the confidence in someone who just went where the truth led, but someone who already had an idea of what the truth ought to be. First of all, for an article about Japanese web design, there's a distinct lack of sources in Japanese. The majority of these sources are in English. The only one in Japanese is about some ways to improve web user experience for older Japanese people, which is somewhat relevant given Japan's aging population. However, it doesn't claim Japanese web design is quote-unquote weird in general, but only gives some tips on how to help older Japanese people navigate a website better with sensible design. If you want some analysis by an actual Japanese web designer, you might want to check the inline link in this paragraph of Sabrina Cruz's article, which isn't listed in the source list for whatever reason. This article makes the same claims as a lot of the articles I found by Googling. For example, Japanese websites don't use much negative space, there are too much contents in too little space, everything has to be presented upfront and not hidden away in menus, and so on and so forth. There are 3 English blog posts that directly addresses why Japanese web design is weird. Only one of these is listed in the source list. The other 2 are inline citations. One of the inline citations was actually the reason why Sabrina Cruz even made her video in the first place. At least that's what she claimed. While the sources I've just mentioned are quite insightful, Sabrina Cruz never studied them directly, and instead she chose to further her own narrative with the rest of the sources, which are much less relevant. Many of these are about programming and web crawling, which only supports Sabrina Cruz's little web crawling experiment. Some are about the history of the web, and by the web, I mean the English language web. There's no insight unique to the weirdness of the Japanese web, which is the very subject of Sabrina Cruz's video. The other sources mostly support only Sabrina Cruz's narrative in the later segments in her video, in which she reveals the supposedly true reason why Japan's web design is weird. Okay, that's enough of the sources. Let's get back to the video. The first segments are mostly time-wasting fluff. And boy, look at these supremely helpfully named chapters. Overcompensating for 60 seconds. Is this a woman in STEM? What does that mean? These segments give some background on her thought process that led to the video, which I don't personally care about. There's this segment about how she sent out a tweet to her fans and got, predictably, no useful response. I can't for the life of me figure out why this segment was so important that it must be included with its own chapter title. I ruined my DMs for content. Was this how she found experts to consult her for research? Just scream at the crowd of randos on Twitter and chat with them in the DMs? Just to give you an idea of how doable it is to find experts, here's a YouTuber with much smaller numbers than Answer in Progress. Despite being a Silicon Valley software engineer of Japanese descent, she was very transparent about her cultural ignorance, potentially skewed perspective, and blind spots. So, what she did was to involve her colleagues in Japan. It's not goddamn rocket science. If you don't know, ask people who know. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's faster. I'm saying it's doable. And it should be done. And you know how I found this YouTuber? Sabrina Cruz cited one of her videos in this bloody article. Maybe a better use of your 8 weeks could have been, I don't know, emailing that YouTuber who might just be able to hook you up with some Japanese web designers instead of chatting with some random strangers on Twitter, no? Anyway, after 2 minutes of fluffy shenanigans, we finally got to the point. Oh, thank heaven. In the chapter intuitively titled Overcompensating for 60 Seconds, Sabrina Cruz summarized the methodology for her primary research: web crawling and AI-powered data evaluation. Essentially, what she did here was as follows. Step 1. Get a list of the most popular websites from a web tracker called semrush.com. Step 2. Categorize these websites by the general interest of their content, such as travel, education, or porn. Step 3. Arbitrarily filter out websites she deemed pornographic, spammy, or malware-y. Step 4. Run a web crawler that captures screenshots of the remaining websites. Step 5. Not evaluating these screenshots by eye, because there are too many, but throw them all into an AI-powered blender and let it evaluate the data for you. Now let's just get back to the problem of primary research. Like I said, primary research should be done by experts with highly relevant experience. If you want to find out whether Japanese web design is weird, you'd better be damn sure you know how to research that. Or at least you'd better collaborate with people who do know. Here's a friendly reminder that Sabrina Cruz doesn't appear to be a Japanese web designer, nor does she appear to know one, which I feel like the prerequisite for conducting primary research into Japanese web design. Her only relevant experience is web crawling, which, I admit, is useful for gathering data more efficiently. That being said, as a non-woman in non-STEM, I can see several problems with her process. For step 2, I don't think categorized websites by general interest is the right way for researching web design. Websites aren't generally designed because they follow a particular interest, but because of how they're intended to be used. While certain categories she used seem to reflect this, such as instant messaging, web-based email, and file repository, most of them do not say anything about how they ought to be designed. For example, the main difference between a travel site and a shopping site might just be that they use different parameters for their search filters, but not necessarily about how they should lay out their contents on a page. Other categories are uselessly vague. What does it mean to be an education website? A university's official website? An edutainment YouTuber's redirect dump? A teacher's forum? An online course marketplace? None of these distinct types of websites would have remotely similar designs. Also, what if there are overlaps between categories, which there must have been, such as an education website that distributes illegal software like pirated bilingual dictionaries? For step 3,
okay, I know that this shouldn't surprise me, but the internet is full of a lot of not great stuff. Just looking at some of these categories. We've got explicit, illegal, spam, suspected malware. I'm just gonna...
Very cute. Now, what's the point of this? If a website's popular, it's popular. What does being explicit have to do with the quality of its design? In fact, for a country as sexually liberated as Japan, explicit content should be par for the course. Honestly, I'd rather include a smutty website with thoughtful design like this over whatever this family-friendly mess is supposed to be. God, I hope this wasn't the reason. This arbitrary prudishness was never justified, by the way. It's funny because, 1, you're never gonna see the vast majority of the results, and 2, she actually did a bit about this later.
A whole bunch of columns, really tiny images, often of content that I cannot show you. I tried so hard to filter. The internet just has so much I'm sorry.
Good one. Okay. If you were not gonna show anything, and if you couldn't filter them all anyway, why even bother filtering any in the first place? You'd think I'm harping on about this a little bit too much because I am, but it's actually very important. We don't know what her standards were, we don't know what she arbitrarily included and excluded, and we don't know how many websites she included for each country. This means all we can do is just take her word for the validity of her data, which, as I will point out later, is pretty sus. For step 5, she did not evaluate the data herself and only relied on some AI technobabble. It's understandable that she couldn't afford to visually examine 2,000 pictures, either by herself or with the professional web designer's help. But this was a self-inflicted handicap. She chose to design her primary research this way. Nobody forced her to take screenshots for every country in the world. If I were her, I'd stick to only a few relevant countries with similarities in culture or with the most domestic internet traffic. Hell, only showing results for a few countries is exactly what she did after this. Now, here's the result of Sabrina Cruz's dubious attempt at primary research. I didn't skip step 4, I just thought it'd be easier to point out what's wrong with it, with this plot of data she had her AI made. Even though the quality of these screenshots is horrendous, I can already see more problems. Sabrina Cruz conveniently disregarded the results for international websites like Google and Facebook. However, you can clearly see there are lots of screenshots for these 2 websites alone. Why? Did she neglect to filter out redirects, which would have been more important than filtering out porn? Next, she seemed to think that the pattern for these clumps of screenshots are on these 2 neatly straight axes. However, the distribution of light and dark websites is more like this. Next, these screenshots over here don't look like medium dark or light websites. They just look like regular light websites with an active modal on. Some modal designs deliberately darken the main contents with a partially transparent layer. Next, all the screenshots seem to have the same dimension as Sabrina Cruz's laptop screen, which means we don't know if these so-called dark websites are even truly dark. Many websites contain a large topmost element, such as a photo, video, or carousel, which may be dark or light. If these elements are auto-played or auto-animated, they're even more unpredictable. How do we know whether these screenshots were taken at an appropriate time? If we scroll down, will the web pages still appear predominantly dark or predominantly light? What if some of these websites have fancy loading animations that transition from dark to light? Many of these so-called dense results contain grids of pictures. That's a hallmark of e-commerce, music streaming, movie streaming, and video sharing websites. They're dense because of their very nature, not just because somebody just arbitrarily decided so. You can't expect them to have the same minimalist emptiness as, say, an official corporate website. To compare rakuten.co.jp to apple.com is to compare oranges to apple. It does not work. There should have been different plots for different types of websites where rakuten.co.jp could have been compared fairly to, say, ebay.com. So the data seemed pretty bad, but when Sabrina Cruz tried analyzing them, things got even worse.
Oh yeah, I've just changed all the screenshots to little circles to make it easier to see things more clearly. So, Japan. Ta-da! It's the red dots. We've got a little Google over there. Right off the bat, we can see that it kind of avoids this sector up here, but we don't know if that is a common distribution. Maybe a bunch of other countries avoid this corner. We need to compare. So let's see how it compares against the United States, Canada, the UK, Ukraine, Indonesia, Mexico. Are you seeing this? All of the countries have wide varieties of web design except for Japan. Japan seems to be avoiding this sector that is defined by dark, empty spaces. In other words, Japan's websites are brightly colored and dense, just like the theory claims. Did I just prove something?
Here are the screenshots simplified into circles and color-coded by country. I'm assuming each circle represents one screenshot for one website, maybe except for Google and Facebook. Sabrina Cruz bombarded you with quick cuts of a few select countries to further her narrative about how conveniently weird Japanese websites tend to look. But when you actually stop to count these circles, the narrative falls apart. Go ahead and count, don't just take my word for it. Here are my counts. The first thing that stood out to me was how tiny these sample sizes were. Just how much porn and spam did she filter out? There's a good reason why legitimate studies need large sample sizes. It's so that whatever pattern that shows up isn't a coincidence. With sample sizes this small, 2 or 3 circles off and you get a completely different pattern. Case in point, I could just get rid of the 4 circle difference between Japan and Korea and I'll end up with the same pattern for both countries. I could even get the same pattern with China too. But Sabrina Cruz just went ahead with patterns that conveniently supported her narrative anyway. Speaking of China, why was there such a massive difference between it and other regions? Was there somehow less porn, less spam, less malware in 2022 in China, of all places in the world? Did she conflate regions that used traditional Chinese and regions that used simplified Chinese? These writing systems are distinct enough that they might affect web design, particularly web fonts. Sabrina actually tried to address the problem of font file sizes later, so this was a big oversight in my opinion. So as you can tell, I'm not really a big fan of 1. Non-experts who attempt at primary research they're clearly not qualified for. 2. Poorly designed primary research with very questionable methodology. And 3. Primary research with unusable and inconsistent sample sizes that only confirm the non-experts' biases. No, you didn't prove or disprove anything. Your research was garbage. Finally, Sabrina Cruz moved on to, quote-unquote, test the possible reasons of Japanese weird web design she found from her secondary research. You'll notice that she wasn't actually testing any of them. She didn't even mention any of them. What she only did was to add her own techie analyses. And unfortunately, she failed spectacularly. First, let's start with characters. This segment is riddled with half-truths and lots of very basic misunderstandings of the subject.
You see, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean writing systems share a bunch of logographic characters. These are individual symbols that represent whole words. The sheer amount of these CJK characters in existence lead to massive font file sizes. For comparison, this is a font that's designed to support Greek, Cyrillic, and Latin-based writing systems. It contains less than 4,000 glyphs. That's typography speak for a representation of a character. These are 3 different glyphs. Now let's look at a font that supports all of those languages as well as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Keep in mind, these writing systems do not have capital letters. It's so much more.
First, minor correction. The uppercase A and the lowercase a are 2 distinct characters, not 2 glyphs of the same character. Now, the 2 example fonts she used here are Noto Sans and Noto Sans Traditional Chinese. Noto Sans Traditional Chinese is meant to support, no surprise, Traditional Chinese. If you're wondering why in the world she cited Noto Sans Traditional Chinese, well, Noto Sans Japanese had always existed, I think I know why.
You see, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean writing systems share a bunch of logographic characters. Now let's look at a font that supports all of those languages as well as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean.
It's very obvious to me that she simply assumed that Noto Sans Traditional Chinese works in the same way as Noto Sans Japanese. In fact, she just assumed that CJK characters are all alike, given how much she just kept saying CJK, and the one source she used for this is this Wikipedia article. Here are 4 text samples, set to 4 different fonts. The differences between simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese are not easy to spot if you're not familiar with them. But the Chinese samples are clearly different from the Japanese and the Korean ones. These are all ideographs, which are characters that represent full words. These are also ideographs, but these are syllabograms, which are characters that represent syllables. And this isn't even an ideographic system, it's an alphabetic system. It turns out CJK isn't a monolith. There are actually lots of crucial differences between the C, the J, and the K. Even if we consider only CJK ideographs, there are still tons of differences. Here are 4 different glyphs for the exact same character across 4 different CJK fonts. So no, Noto Sans Traditional Chinese does not support Japanese and Korean. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made separate versions for these languages. In fact, if you think about it for 1 second, this is an absurd claim. If you cherry-pick a font that supports all East Asian writing systems, plus Latin, Greek, and Cyrillic, why are you surprised that they contain that many glyphs? Now the point she was trying to make here is that East Asian fonts contain lots of glyphs, therefore they are harder to produce, harder to download, and there are fewer options for them. These claims are debatable at best, but even worse, the foundations for them are very shaky. For one, even though Noto Sans is popularly used as a web typeface, it's actually the worst example possible. It's not that East Asian fonts contain over 65,000 glyphs, is that the Noto Sans CJK fonts that contain over 65,000 glyphs. The objective of the Noto project is to support all characters in all written languages in existence. But nobody in East Asia ever needs that kind of support. The essential characters for each East Asian language are significantly lower, and the keyword here is essential. Of all CJK ideographs alone, here are the numbers of essential characters by country. For China, that's 8,105. For Taiwan, that's 11,151. For Japan, that's 2,999. I couldn't find an up-to-date list of ideographs for South and North Korea, primarily because ideographs are extremely rare in current regular Korean writing, which is predominantly alphabetic. Korean ideographs are mostly found in dictionaries and academic writings. One website claims South Korea uses 1,800 characters and North Korea uses 3,000, although proficiency in these ideographs seems to be elective rather than mandatory. But none of this information even matters, because this figure, 65,535 glyphs, is complete BS. Even though it's listed on the official about pages for all Noto Sans CJK fonts, the glyph counts of the actual fonts are much lower. Noto Sans Japanese, for instance, only contained 17,936 glyphs in 2022. So why is this fallacious figure listed here? Notice how the font name is Noto Sans JP up here, but it's Noto Sans CJK JP down here. That's right, these are two different fonts. You cannot get Noto Sans CJK JP with all 65,000 glyphs at Google Fonts. You have to go to GitHub, where you can get the full versions, language-specific versions, and region-specific versions of the Noto font family. Noto Sans CJK JP with all 65,535 glyphs contains all CJK ideographs and Hangul syllables for Korean, only with distinct Japanese outlines. Noto Sans JP with only 17,936 glyphs contains ideographs that are used only in Japanese with no simplified and traditional Chinese glyphs and no Hangul syllables. What do you know? Turns out you don't need all those 65,000 glyphs after all. By the way, Noto Sans JP has been available since January 27th, 2022, 10 months before Sabrina Cruz released her video, which she said only took 2 months to make. To be fair, I can't blame Sabrina Cruz for not knowing this, if all she got was the about pages at Google Fonts and she didn't really understand what the information meant. But for heaven's sake, if she just talked to one person familiar with how Japanese fonts work, they would have told her that 65,000 glyphs is an idiotically large and unnecessary number of glyphs. Obviously, the average East Asian would never need over 65,000 glyphs to read the news or write shitposts on social media. Most East Asian fonts contain much fewer than 65,000 glyphs, and many Korean fonts have no ideographs whatsoever. You might think I'm nitpicking, which I am, but this bogus figure was precisely how she tried to prove the point about how East Asian fonts are quote-unquote massive for the web. What about file sizes though? While 18,000 glyphs is much fewer than 65,000, it's still a lot. The file size for each weight of Noto Sans JP in 2022 is a little under 5 megabytes, which is still unacceptable for a web font. You want to keep your web fonts at most somewhere around 1 megabyte. Now, if more glyphs make fonts larger, what should you do? Well, use fewer glyphs. If you know for sure you're never gonna be using certain characters, don't waste storage and bandwidth for them. The 18,000 glyphs of Noto Sans JP still contain lots of bloat. For example, why is there still support for Korean, Chinese, Greek, and Cyrillic in here? To make this font any usable for the web, you have to get rid of all that bloat and keep only the barest of essentials. This is where subsetting comes in. To subset a font is to keep only a subset of essential glyphs from that font, which means no unnecessary alternate glyphs and open type features. For Japanese, this subset amounts to a little over 3,000 glyphs. There's no shortage of tutorials on how to subset your fonts for the web. Here's a tutorial from 2018 on subsetting Noto Sans. By subsetting and using compressed file formats, you can achieve file sizes as small as 300 kilobytes. To say this is massive is simply laughable. And you may not have to do it manually either. Here's Adobe Fonts with their dynamic subsetting feature from 2018. According to Adobe, dynamic subsetting enables Adobe Fonts' server to serve you only the glyphs you need, nothing more, nothing less, on the fly. It can even update on user interaction. For example, in the comments section. Here's a Japanese web font provider with the same feature. In fact, Sabrina Cruz should have known about this, given that she cited this article in her video and article. Quote, now Chinese web font providers cleverly scan through a web page's text to identify which glyphs are required, and send only those to the user instead of all 13,000 plus, unquote. This 2015 article was the only reason I even knew dynamic subsetting was already a thing in China. So next, here's Sabrina Cruz's other argument about fonts.
And finally, that lack of capitalization means that graphic designers lose a tool for creating visual hierarchy.
Okay. If capitalization was somehow a problem to East Asian fonts, why would it only be a problem to only East Asian fonts? Capitalization is unique to alphabetic systems from Europe. Do you have any idea how many writing systems out there that don't have capitalization either? Furthermore, if you know the first thing about visual hierarchy, you'll know saying lack of capitalization means that graphic designers lose a tool for creating visual hierarchy makes about as much sense as lack of gloves means that construction workers lose a tool for laying bricks. Here are just a few ways to create visual hierarchy without using a single capital letter. You can use different typefaces, different styles, different colors, different values, different font sizes. Here are even more ways to apply visual hierarchy to graphics, and of course, without using any letter. Are you seriously telling me that lack of capitalization of all things in the world makes it that much harder to see visual hierarchy? This is such a lazy way to shoehorn two buzzwords in a sentence without actually understanding what they mean.
So we learned something interesting. It was just useless. Put that on my tombstone.
I don't agree it's interesting and useless. I think it's just plain useless. Anyway, let's move on to culture.
But what about culture? This was a tricky one because I was a STEM student, so I don't have a lot of the domain knowledge necessary to accurately identify and compare global cultures. However, being a STEM student also means that didn't stop me from trying. I started off by using geographic proximity, but that failed. So then I used a binary identifier for if a country was part of the global north or global south. Also no pattern. But like I said, I don't know if this is the best way to compare cultures. However, given what I've found, I'm just not convinced that culture is the primary cause of Japan's unique web design.
So let me get this straight. So you just did a pointless analysis that, by your own admission, may not be the best way to compare cultures. And when you predictably found no results, your conclusion was, I'm not convinced culture was the answer here. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you want to figure out why only one of these three people is a novelist and the other two aren't. Now, how would you go about this? Would you consider their cultural exposure to novels? Would you consider their cultural influence from their parents, teachers, or friends who may be novel readers or novelists themselves? Would you consider the cultural influence by the works of their favorite authors? Would you consider the cultural influence from interests, genres, trends and tropes found in popular media? Or And hear me out. You go find out whether they all live in geographic proximity, and whether they possess the tertiary identifier for if someone is from an upper class, middle class, or lower class household. And when you predictably find no pattern, would you think to yourself, man, I just wasted my time for no good reason? Or would you proudly say this to millions of people? Given what I found, which is nothing, I'm not convinced culture is the primary cause for why this person is a novelist. Like, is it an it thing in the STEM student community to waste time doing things you're not qualified to do? Finally, technology. Here we have to sit through over 2 whole minutes of needless padding trivia and mandatory YouTubers antics. I mean, for heaven's sake, if you want to share this cool article you found, just tell your viewers to read it on their own time. Now, according to Sabrina Cruz, characters aren't the primary cause, and neither is culture. But she's finally figured it out. She's finally cracked the code on the reason why Japan's internet is weirdly designed. What is it?
So what else could have caused Japanese web design to fracture off? Well, we need to consider this. The rise of smartphones. It's 2007, and suddenly all of these websites that were designed for desktop viewing are too difficult to navigate on small phone screens and too data heavy to load on limited plans. The easy answer was to start simplifying navigation, reducing content, making things bigger. This all resulted in this minimalist design that we're all familiar with, that we call modern. So it seems like it wasn't language or culture that caused Japan's web design to fracture off from the rest of the world. Instead, it's that their websites never adopted the practices for mobile-friendly web design. But why? When the Western web began simplifying for the iPhone, Japanese web designers didn't need to do that because Japanese people weren't using the iPhone.
Okay, Japanese web designers didn't need to simplify for the iPhone because Japanese people weren't using the iPhone. First question. How in the world did you know that? Did you talk to an actual Japanese web designer? Did I miss that interview somewhere in this entire mess of a video? Second, Japanese people weren't using the iPhone? Let me just check with my collection of graphs for Japan's annual mobile market share real quick. Maybe I should print these graphs out, scribble on them and throw them away, wasting paper for no good reason and earning YouTuber-style credibility. 2 birds with 1 stone. First year, when the iPhone was introduced, maybe she's right. Second year, oh look, there's Apple. Third year, about the same. Fourth year, ooh, second place. Fifth year, damn, first place. Sixth year, seventh year, eighth year, ninth year, 10th year, 11th year, 12th year, 13th year, 14th year. Japanese web designers didn't change because Japanese people weren't using the iPhone? Hey, wait a minute. Are you seriously telling me that for the last 10 years, Japanese web designers look at Japan's growing mobile market and were like, you know, I don't think this iPhone thing is gonna catch on. Like, what the hell are you talking about? If there's one thing I know about Japanese mobile users, is that they love the iPhone there. I mean, what's more likely? That Japanese web designers just collectively decided to call it quits on innovation sometime between 2008 and 2011 and have never tried again? Or a couple of cherry-picked examples of websites that just happen to look outdated? In fact, are Japanese websites even that weird to begin with? I mean, I get goo.ne.jp and especially yahoo.co.jp. Look at that ancient logo. But what about other websites? Are they really oddly maximalist? Do they use too many colors, small images, and lots of text? Rakuten.co.jp. There's clearly only one brand color, this shade of red. Yellow and blue are occasionally used for contrast. These things down here are custom graphics. You're allowed to deviate from the identity palette with custom graphics. Nobody would bat an eye if these were plain photos. This pink is for a secondary brand called Rakuten Mobile. The rainbow up here is a color coding system, so there's actually a purpose for multiple colors. This weird gradient was a one-time anniversary thing. They even have a cute mascot. Wouldn't mascots be, culturally speaking, a Japanese thing? This was how the website looked in 2015. What do you know? They have simplified after all. Shousetsu.com. It's a platform for light novelists. It's supposed to be fun and inviting. There are only 3 recurring colors: teal, orange, and cyan. These are custom graphics, they don't count. There's still teal everywhere in these graphics too. Without these graphics, you'll barely notice anything quote-unquote weird. That's an anime character. I want to take a shot in the dark and guess that, culturally speaking, anime is a Japanese thing. What about these 3 squares? It's a ranking thing. Can you guess? Yeah, it's gold, silver, and bronze. It actually means something. Here's what the website looked like in 2010. What do you know? It was even more minimalist than it is now. If you want something minimalist now, you can go to shousetsu.org, not .com, .org. The other 3 are definitely outdated. Not weird, just weirdly outdated. They haven't changed in forever. In fact, if you think about it, inertia could just be a cultural thing. These websites are probably run by boomers and still pander to boomers. Let's check for something else on semrush.com. Remember that? That's where Sabrina Cruz found her websites. I mean, cherry pick hard enough and you'll find comparable numbers of maximalist and minimalist websites. One thing I noticed that some websites are actually relatively minimalist. The amount of content isn't that big. It's just that the content isn't as spaced out as your typical Western websites. Things just feel a little crowded. The complexity of the characters also contributes to that feeling of crowdedness. The font sizes may be smaller and the images often are smaller to fit in as much content as they can get away with. There's also noticeably more custom graphics with text on them. This was probably the old way to cope with large font file sizes. If you think of these graphics as promotional posters, it shouldn't surprise you why they're so colorful and busy. In conclusion, why is Japan's web design weird, and is it even weird in the first place? I don't think so. Some websites are weird and others aren't. I don't know why the weird websites are weird, but I'm leaning toward cultural reasons. Perhaps Japanese people are used to clutter because they're used to the complexity of kanji. Perhaps they're actually averse to risk and want everything to be presented to them, not hidden away in menus or at the bottom of the page. Perhaps they don't like scrolling or swiping too much. Perhaps a lot of them are just old and not willing to adapt to modern design trends. Whatever the reasons are, the existence of minimalist websites proves that this isn't necessarily something set in stone and there's always room for change. And of course, don't even bother with Answer in Progress's video. It's a terrible video. I would say I wish they'd improve, but after watching another time-wasting train wreck of a video on their channel a couple of weeks ago, I'm not sure they would at all. Hey Sabrina Cruz, on the off chance you're watching this video, I'll be frank with you. Stop trying to outsmart people by attempting something you're not qualified to do. Stop humble bragging about your STEM background and your coding skills. Nobody cares. Start doing secondary research better and reading your materials thoroughly. Start getting in touch with experts, getting them on your show, putting some of that Patreon funding to good use. Stop trying to build a narrative in spite of the facts. Start going where the facts lead. And if they lead nowhere, it's perfectly fine to scrap your video ideas. I'm sure your audience would appreciate more if you spend more than 2 months on a good, factual, well-informed video rather than an expedient, ill-informed, and time-wasting one. Anyway, if you want to actually know plausible reasons why Japanese web design seems weird, check out the sources in the description. I didn't even find some of these, I just took them straight from Sabrina Cruz's list. Do keep in mind that most of these claims are observations and opinions, so take them for what they are, with skepticism of course. That's it.